History is filled with moments of brilliance, great art, soaring cathedrals, epic poetry. But lurking beneath the grandeur of the medieval world was something far darker, a shadow world of iron, fire, and suffering that most history books gloss over in a single paragraph. Today we're pulling back the curtain on that shadow world. These are the 20 most horrific torture devices ever used in medieval times. A warning before we begin. This content is intended for mature audiences. What you're about to hear is deeply disturbing. But understanding history, even its darkest chapters, is how we make sure we never repeat them. Let's begin. Number 20 in the stocks and pillory. We start with something most people consider almost tame, but don't be fooled. The stocks and pillory were instruments of profound psychological and physical torment. Victims were locked in place in public squares, their hands, feet, or head immobilized in wooden frames, for days at a time, exposed to the elements, to rotten food, to stones, to humiliation. People died in the pillory, not from the device itself, but from the crowd. Mobs would hurl rocks with deadly accuracy, and the trapped victim had absolutely no way to defend themselves. Public shame was a weapon in medieval society, and the pillory was its sharpest edge. Number 19. The thumbscrew simple. Elegant. Devastating. The thumbscrew was a small, portable vise. 3 upright metal rods connected by a flat bar that could be slowly, methodically tightened. Thumbs or fingers were inserted between the rods. Then the interrogator would turn the screw. 1 rotation, 2. The bones in the fingers would first compress, then crack, then break entirely. The thumbscrew was a favorite of the Spanish Inquisition because it required no fire, no elaborate setup, just a small device, a table, and patience. The psychological terror of watching the screw turn was often as effective as the pain itself. Number 18. The heretic's fork. This device was designed not to kill, but to exhaust. A double-pronged fork. 1 set of prongs under the chin, the other pressed against the sternum, was held in place by a leather strap around the neck. The prongs were just sharp enough to cause discomfort the moment the victim's head drooped forward in sleep or fatigue. It was most commonly used to force confessions out of people accused of heresy. The person couldn't speak, couldn't eat, could barely move. They could only stand or sit perfectly upright, or suffer the prongs. Sleep deprivation alone can break a person's mind within days. The heretic's fork made sure that sleep was never an option. Number 17. The Judas cradle. Here's where things take a distinctly more sinister turn. The Judas cradle, also called the Judas chair, was a tall, pyramid-shaped seat with an extremely sharp point at the apex. The victim was suspended above the device by ropes, then slowly lowered onto the point. The torturer controlled the pace. Sometimes weights were attached to the victim's legs to speed things along. The device was rarely cleaned between uses, meaning infection was an almost certain death sentence, even if the torture itself didn't kill. It could last hours. It was designed to maximize suffering while keeping the victim alive and conscious as long as possible. Number 16. The rack, perhaps the most iconic torture device in history. The rack was a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim was laid flat, wrists tied to one roller, ankles tied to the other. The rollers were then cranked in opposite directions, slowly stretching the body beyond its natural limits. Shoulders displaced, hips separated from their sockets, knees and elbows pulled apart. Vertebrae were stretched beyond their limits. The rack was not just painful, it was permanently destructive. Survivors, if you could call them that, were often unable to walk or use their hands again. In England, it was one of the few torture devices whose use required royal authorization. Number 15. The Iron Maiden. Few devices have captured the dark imagination quite like this one. A large, human-shaped cabinet lined on the inside with long iron spikes. The victim was placed inside, and the doors were slowly closed. The spikes were deliberately positioned to avoid instantly vital organs, pressing into the arms, the legs, the torso, keeping the victim alive inside the cabinet for hours. or longer. What makes the Iron Maiden particularly chilling is the expressionless face carved on the outside, serene, almost angelic, while inside, unimaginable suffering unfolded. Historians debate how widely it was actually used, but its very existence tells us something profound and disturbing about the medieval mind. Number 14, the Pear of Anguish. The name alone should give you pause. The Pear of Anguish was a metal device shaped like a pear, divided into segments that could be expanded by turning a screw at the top. It was inserted into the mouth, throat, or other areas of the victim's body, then slowly opened from the inside. It was used primarily on those accused of heresy, homosexuality, or lying under oath. The expanding segments would cause severe internal damage. It was rarely fatal on its own. It was a prelude, a way to weaken someone before the real interrogation began. One of the most psychologically devastating aspects was that the victim could see exactly what was about to be done to them. Number 13, the breast ripper. Specifically designed to target women accused of adultery, heresy, or witchcraft, the breast ripper was a metal claw, sometimes heated, used to cause severe harm. It represents one of the most gendered forms of medieval torture, a deliberate targeting of the female body as both punishment and humiliation. It was used across Europe during witch trials and inquisitions. The wounds it caused were almost always fatal due to infection, blood loss, or shock. It stands as a grim reminder that medieval torture was not random. It was often calculated, purposeful, and deeply tied to the social and religious prejudices of the time. Number 12, the wheel Catherine's wheel, named ironically after Saint Catherine, who legend says was martyred on one. The victim was tied spread eagle to a large wagon wheel. The executioner would then use a heavy hammer or iron bar to methodically break every major bone in the body, working from the extremities inward toward the torso. Legs first, arms next, then the chest. Death could take days. In some sentences, the wheel was then mounted on a pole and hoisted into the air, leaving the victim exposed to the elements and to birds. It was a public spectacle designed to send a message. This is what defiance costs. Number 11, the saw deceptively simple, horrifyingly effective. The condemned person was hung upside down, which kept blood flowing to the brain, ensuring consciousness was maintained. Then a large two-handled saw was used to divide the body, beginning at the lower half. Starting upside down meant the victim remained fully aware through much of the process. It was a method of execution reserved for those considered the most offensive to the state or the church. Traitors, heretics, those accused of crimes so severe that a quick death was considered an insult to justice. It required no special equipment, just a saw, a rope, and 2 willing executioners. Number 10, the scold's bridle. Also called the branks, this was a metal cage locked around the head, featuring a spiked plate or flat plate that was inserted into the mouth and pressed down on the tongue. Any attempt to speak or move the tongue would result in the plate causing discomfort. It was used almost exclusively on women, specifically women accused of being gossips, naggers, or troublemakers. The accused would often be paraded through the streets while wearing it, a public shaming ritual that combined physical pain with community humiliation. It is one of history's starkest examples of how social control and physical torture were used hand in hand against women. Number 9, the strappado, one of the most widely used torture methods in medieval Europe, and one of the most deceivingly simple. The victim's hands were tied behind their back. They were then hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists, suspending all of their body weight through their arms in reverse. Then they were dropped, sometimes to within inches of the ground, sometimes allowed to hit the ground. The sudden jerk causing severe shoulder injuries simultaneously. It could be repeated, over and over. The strappado was a standard tool of the Inquisition precisely because it left few visible marks while causing significant internal damage. Number 8, the knee splitter, exactly as severe as the name suggests. 2 spike blocks were placed on either side of the knee and slowly pressed together using a vice mechanism. The spikes would first press into the skin, then cause damage through cartilage, then destroy the knee joint entirely. It wasn't used to kill, it was used to permanently disable. A person with damaged knees could still confess, could still talk, could still be used as a witness or made an example of. The knee splitter ensured that even if you survived the dungeon, you would carry the memory of it in every step you tried to take for the rest of your life. Number 7, the lead sprinkler. A ladle with a perforated top, almost like a large metal spoon, filled with molten lead, boiling water, or boiling oil. The torturer would then flick or sprinkle the liquid over the victim's body. The perforations allowed precise, controlled application, a fine spray rather than a single pour, meaning the torturer could work slowly and deliberately across every inch of exposed skin. It was used extensively during the Inquisition against those who refused to recant their
Physical
beliefs.
agony was compounded by the smell, the sound, and the sight of one's own skin reacting to the extreme heat. Number 6, the coffin torture. The victim was placed inside a metal cage roughly shaped to the human body, sometimes slightly larger, sometimes deliberately too small. This cage was then hung from a tree, a gibbet, or a dungeon ceiling. In milder sentences, the victim was left there for hours. In severe cases, for days. In extreme cases, until death. Birds would approach the exposed areas. The sun would beat down. The cold night air would set in. The cage was sometimes made to fit so tightly that the body could not shift position at all. For larger prisoners, the cage was sometimes made intentionally smaller, compressing the body painfully. It was one of the most psychologically destructive forms of torture ever devised, because it gave the victim nothing to do but wait. Number 5, the chair of torture. Also called the Judas chair's more elaborate cousin, the chair of torture was an iron throne covered entirely in spikes, hundreds of them, pointed inward. The victim was strapped down onto the chair, and the spikes, while not long enough to reach vital organs immediately, would press into the skin across every surface of the body that made contact with the seat. Tightening the straps would push the body harder into the spikes. Some versions included a heating element beneath the seat. Sessions in the chair could last hours, and the physical strain alone was enough to cause serious harm. Confessions extracted from the chair were almost always immediate. Number 4, rat torture. No mechanical device required for this one, just a container, a rat, and patience. The rat was placed in a metal bucket, which was then secured against the victim's exposed body. Heat was applied to the outside of the bucket. With no escape route, the rat, panicked and desperate, would do the only thing it could, attempt to break free through any means possible. The process could take hours. It was used across medieval Europe and Asia as an interrogation method, and its effectiveness was unfortunately well documented. It required no craftsmanship, no forge, no engineering, which made it accessible to anyone willing to inflict it. Number 3, the Brazen Bull. Ancient in origin, but used well into medieval times, the Brazen Bull was a hollow bronze statue in the shape of a bull, with a door on the side. The victim was locked inside. A fire was lit beneath the statue. As the bronze heated, the victim inside would be slowly overcome by the extreme heat. But the designers of this device added one final disturbing touch. A series of tubes and pipes in the bull's head were engineered so that the sounds of the person inside would be converted into sounds resembling the bellowing of an actual bull. The audience heard an animal. The victim experienced something no language has ever adequately described. Number 2, flaying, among the oldest and most feared punishments in human history. Flaying, the removal of skin from a living person, was practiced in medieval Europe, the Middle East, and Asia as both execution and torture. It was reserved for the most despised criminals and enemies of the state. The process was deliberately slow. Skilled executioners were trained to keep the victim alive as long as possible, removing the outer layer in large, careful sections. Death from flaying, when it came, arrived through shock, blood loss, or infection. In some historical accounts, the remains were then displayed publicly, on walls or city gates, as a warning. It represents perhaps the most complete annihilation of human dignity ever systematized into law. Number 1. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. And here we reach the apex, the most elaborate, most legally codified, most publicly performed act of torture and execution in medieval history. Used in England primarily for those convicted of high treason, the full sentence was breathtaking in its severity. The condemned was dragged through the streets on a hurdle, a wooden frame, to the place of execution. Then hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive. Then subjected to further punishment. Then the internal organs were removed and disposed of before the victim's eyes while they still breathed. Then beheaded. And finally, the body was divided into 4 parts, which were sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom as a warning. It was not just an execution. It was a statement. A message written in the most visceral language possible. Do not defy the crown. History's darkest chapters are not comfortable to explore, but they are necessary. Every device we've discussed today existed within a legal and social framework, authorized by governments, sanctioned by courts, sometimes blessed by religious institutions. These were not the acts of lone madmen. They were systems. And that is perhaps the most disturbing truth of all, because systems, as history shows us again and again, can always be rebuilt. The only thing standing between civilization and the dungeon is the collective decision to never go back. Remember that, and never stop remembering it.